Royal guards searched Camilla's closet, then uncovered the late Queen's coronation robe, a true story of duty, grief, and a secret hidden behind a palace door. There is a certain kind of mourning inside Buckingham Palace that very few people in the world ever get to experience. The kind where the light slides in slowly through tall, draped windows, where the corridors are quiet except for the soft, measured echo of footsteps on stone floors, and where the whole enormous building seems to be holding its breath. Outside, London is already awake and moving, buses rattling down the Mall, pigeons scattering in the gray morning air, the dull roar of a city that never quite fully sleeps. But inside those thick stone walls, time has always moved a little differently. History does not hurry here, and on one particular autumn morning, somewhere between the changing of the shifts and the first formal briefings of the day, history stopped completely. It was not, at first glance, a dramatic morning. Nobody who arrived at the palace that day had any reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. The royal guards assigned to the building had a job to do. A routine security sweep, the kind scheduled and carried out every few months as a matter of standard palace procedure. These sweeps were methodical and careful, and almost always uneventful. The guards would move from room to room with practiced efficiency, checking windows and access points, testing locks, running through the established checklist that had been refined over years of institutional habit. It was the kind of work that sounds important when you describe it and feels very ordinary when you are actually doing it. The men who did it were professionals. They had seen the inside of every corner of that palace more times than they could easily count. They expected to find nothing unusual. They were wrong. What followed was not immediately extraordinary. The team worked with the steady competence of people who had done this particular job in this particular building many times before. They carried clipboards. They spoke to each other in low voices when they needed to speak at all. There was a certain rhythm to a security sweep, a specific sequence of rooms, a specific set of checks, a specific order to everything, and they followed that rhythm the way experienced people follow any established procedure, which is to say, without thinking very hard about it, trusting the procedure to do the thinking for them. And this is perhaps the thing that makes what happened next so striking in retrospect. Because the very competence and routineness of the morning, the very ordinariness of four experienced professionals doing a job they had done dozens of times before, is what makes the discovery so jarring when it comes. You are not braced for it. Nobody is braced for it. The morning has trained you, right up until the moment it doesn't, to expect nothing. The team assigned that morning consisted of 4 men, all of them experienced, all of them long-serving enough to know the palace the way you only know a building when you have spent years inside it. Not as a visitor, not as a tourist, but as a working presence who has learned its rhythms and its sounds and its moods through daily repetition. They knew which floorboards creaked and where. They knew which doors on the upper floors swelled with the damp in winter and needed a firm shoulder to open. They knew the particular quality of silence in the staterooms after a function, when the cleaning staff had finished, and the last of the evening's guests were long gone, and the building settled back into itself, like a ship that has finally found calm water. The palace, for all its grandeur, was their workplace, and like anyone who spends enough time in a workplace, they had stopped being impressed by it in the way a visitor would be impressed. They moved through it the way you move through any familiar place, with a comfortable inattention to the things that hadn't changed and a sharpened eye for anything that had. The men who worked this sweep had long since learned a professional skill that is unique to people who spend their working lives inside places associated with power and ceremony. The skill of moving through spaces that are objectively extraordinary without reacting to them as extraordinary. You learn, over time, to look at a room containing paintings worth many millions of pounds and see only the windows and the locks. You learn to walk through a corridor lined with gifts from foreign heads of state and focus only on whether the ventilation grate is properly secured. This is not insensitivity to what surrounds you. It is simply the calibration that sustained professional competence requires. If you were awed by the building every time you walked through it, you would never get the job done. And yet even professionals, in unguarded moments, feel the weight of where they are. The palace has a quality that is difficult to describe precisely, a thickness. One of the guards would later say, not of its walls, though the walls are certainly thick, but of accumulated time, of everything that has happened inside it, of all the decisions made in those rooms, and all the conversations that have taken place, and all the moments, large and small, and entirely unrecorded, that have accumulated over 200 years of continuous occupation. You feel it sometimes, in quiet moments, as a kind of pressure, not unpleasant, just present. They started, as protocol required, in the outer rooms and worked their way steadily inward. They moved through sitting rooms hung with oil portraits, frames thick with gilding. They passed shelves lined with gifts from foreign governments, intricately carved objects, crystal pieces, framed photographs of meetings between dignitaries. They checked past china cabinets that stood like sentinels, past ornate writing desks that nobody had written at in decades, past all the accumulated weight of an institution that had been accumulating things for centuries. Everything was as it should be. Every room was logged in sequence. Every window was tested. Every door. They were efficient and quiet, and they moved with the particular economy of motion that comes from doing the same task many times until it becomes a kind of physical memory. When they reached the private wing of the palace allocated to Queen Consort Camilla, they followed exactly the same procedure they had followed in every other part of the building. The private quarters of the senior royals were always included in the sweep. That was policy, and policy existed for a reason. The guards did not approach these rooms with any different attitude than they had brought to the staterooms or the service corridors. A room was a room, a door was a door. Their job was the same everywhere. The first several rooms in Camilla's private wing produced nothing of note. A small reception room, tastefully furnished and tidily kept. A private sitting area where a book sat face down on the arm of a chair, and a cup had left a faint ring on a small wooden table. A dressing room, meticulously organized, with shoes arranged on their racks, and the ordinary tools of grooming lined up on a glass shelf. Ordinary life, lived in private, inside an extraordinary building. The men moved through it all with their clipboards and their quiet professional focus. Then they reached the wardrobe suite. In the ordinary way of palace rooms, the wardrobe suite was not one of the famous ones. It was not a room that appeared in the guidebooks or in the tourist descriptions of the palace. It was not a room associated with any particular historical event or any famous occasion. It was simply the room where clothing was kept, a practical space doing a practical job, which is perhaps the most honest description of a great many rooms inside great buildings. The rooms that get remembered are almost never the practical ones. The rooms that get remembered are the ones where something happened, and until that morning, nothing worth remembering had happened in this one. It was a long, deep room, of a kind that exists almost exclusively in places like this. One entire wall was lined from floor to ceiling with built-in cabinetry, drawers of various depths, shelves, and long hanging rails concealed behind heavy paneled doors, painted a neutral color that had been refreshed so many times over the decades that the panels had a smoothness to them, a painted-over quality that told its own quiet story of the years. Along the opposite wall stood a row of freestanding wardrobes, older in style, made of dark polished wood that had been maintained so conscientiously for so long that the grain had almost disappeared beneath the layers of wax and care. Between the two walls, the room stretched back far enough that the light from the overhead fixture did not quite reach the far corner without casting a slight, soft shadow. There were gowns hanging on the rails, dozens of them, each one sheathed in a thin protective cloth bag designed to keep off dust without trapping moisture. There were formal coats. There were the particular kinds of structured jackets and tailored suits that a life spent in public requires you to maintain in quantity, because the same occasion never quite repeats itself in the same way, and the photographs always get published and people always notice. Everything in the room served a purpose, and everything was arranged according to a system that was clearly understood by the people who worked with it every day. One of the guards began working his way slowly along the far wall, checking behind the freestanding wardrobes, making sure there were no gaps or access points that could be concealed by the furniture. He had done this in other rooms in other palaces, dozens of times. He moved the first wardrobe slightly away from the wall, just enough to check behind it, and found nothing but wall and a little settled dust. He moved to the next. then the next. Routine and unremarkable, right up until the moment it wasn't. Near the back corner of the room, where one of the freestanding wardrobes sat close against the built-in cabinetry, he paused. There was something tucked in the space between the wardrobe and the wall, pushed back deliberately it seemed, so that it would not be immediately visible from the room's entrance. At first glance it might have looked like extra luggage or a garment bag, but it wasn't either of those things. It was wrapped in a heavy ivory cloth, the kind used not for everyday storage, but for something that required a higher level of protection. And around the ivory cloth was a sealed archival casing, a rigid protective box of the sort used by museums and heritage institutions to transport and store items of significant historical value. It was carefully made, and it was sealed with a label on the side that bore a reference number printed in the formal style of an institutional catalog. The guard stared at it for a long moment without touching it. Then he called the others over. It is worth saying something about this instinct, because it matters. The impulse to stop and call rather than to pick up and investigate is not as universal as it might seem. Most people, confronted with something unexpected in a context that seems to call for a response, feel a pull to act immediately, to pick it up, open it, find out. It takes a specific kind of training, or a specific kind of temperament, to resist that pull and wait for the right person instead. These men had both. They were trained, and they were experienced enough to understand that when you don't know what something is, the act of investigating it yourself is often the thing that makes the situation worse. They stood back. They waited. They did the right thing, which was to do nothing until someone who knew more than they did arrived to tell them what to do. All four of them stood in the quiet of that wardrobe suite and looked at the thing together. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. They had been trained for many different kinds of situations. But no training had prepared them for the specific experience of standing in a royal wardrobe suite and understanding, from the evidence in front of them, that what they were looking at was something that had been placed there deliberately and carefully, by someone who knew what it was, in a location where it was not officially supposed to be. The senior officer spoke first, in a low and steady voice. He said they needed someone from the Royal Collection Trust there before anyone touched anything. The others agreed without debate. They secured the room, they made the call, and they waited. The Royal Collection Trust responded with exactly the efficiency you would expect of an institution whose entire purpose is the care of irreplaceable things. The relevant people were contacted in the relevant order. The senior archivist, a woman with more than 2 decades of experience working with some of the most significant objects in existence, who had handled medieval manuscripts and Tudor jewelry and personal correspondence from monarchs going back 400 years, was dispatched to the palace. She arrived within the hour. She had not been told specifically what had been found, only that something from the royal collection appeared to be present in a location where it should not be, and that her identification was needed urgently. Usually the calls she received were about objects found during renovation work, things that had been misplaced over decades, that turned up in attics or behind walls or in the back of cupboards nobody had opened for years. The palace was not the kind of institution where things got forgotten, which was part of what made this different. She had not been told specifically what had been found, only that something from the royal collection appeared to be present in a location where it should not be, and that her identification and assessment were needed. She had conducted assessments before, though never under quite these circumstances. She walked into the wardrobe suite, introduced herself to the guards, and looked at the casing. The moment she saw it, her professional composure held completely. But those present say something shifted briefly in her expression, a controlled flicker of recognition that she returned quickly to the careful neutrality of someone conducting an official assessment. She asked the guards to step back. She pulled on her white conservation gloves. She approached the casing with the slow, deliberate care of someone who already suspects what they are about to find. She examined the seal. Intact. Whatever was inside had not been carelessly disturbed. She noted the reference number on the label. She recognized that number. She knew what catalog entry it corresponded to. She began to unseal the casing. Her hands were completely steady. The ivory cloth came away slowly, fold by deliberate fold, and there it was, the Coronation Robe of Queen Elizabeth II. Not a reproduction, not a ceremonial copy made for display or touring exhibitions. The original, the real one, the robe that had been placed on the shoulders of a 27-year-old woman inside Westminster Abbey on the 2nd of June 1953, in front of 2,000 invited guests and watched by 27 million people on television screens across the country. The robe of deep crimson velvet, its 18-foot train lined with Canadian white ermine, its edges bordered with intricate gold lace worked by hand, stitch by stitch, by people who knew exactly what they were making and what it was for. The archivist stood completely still for a long moment. She looked at it. Then she carefully rewrapped it, resealed the casing, and stepped back. She said quietly that she needed to make a phone call. In the accounts of this moment, that have been pieced together from those who were present, there is a consistency to the description of how the room felt during those few minutes between the discovery and the phone call. It was quiet in a way that rooms are not normally quiet. The 4 guards stood where the archivist had asked them to stand, and they looked at the case, and they did not speak. The archivist stood with her back partly to them, looking at the resealed case, her white gloves still on her hands, her expression unreadable from the angle at which they were standing. And the room held all of it, the discovery, the weight of the recognition, the knowledge of what would now need to happen, in the particular silence of something significant that has not yet fully registered as what it is. To understand why the discovery of that robe in that location stopped everyone who heard about it in their tracks, you have to understand what the robe actually is, not what it looks like. Most people have a general sense of that from photographs, but what it is, what it represents, what it has been holding inside it for more than 70 years. The coronation robe was made in the months leading up to the 1953 ceremony. It was produced by the Royal School of Needlework, an institution that had been creating embroidered and ceremonial pieces for the British royal family since the 19th century. The velvet used in its construction was of a quality that is extremely difficult to source today. A deep, stable crimson chosen specifically because it would hold its color across decades without fading or shifting. The ermine trim came from Canada. The gold lace that bordered the edges and lined certain sections of the train was produced by hand, one stitch at a time, by craftspeople who understood that what they were making would be seen by millions of people and would be part of history from the morning it was first worn. Each stitch placed by a real person who knew, who understood that the work under their hands would be worn at one of the most significant public moments of the century, who knew that photographs of this robe would be seen across the world, reproduced in newspapers and on commemorative objects, studied and discussed for generations. The robe was not assembled quickly. It was made the way things are made when the people making them understand that they are participating in something that will outlast them. And here is the other thing about those makers, the thing that is easy to miss. We do not know their names. That is entirely typical of craft and trade work of the period. The people who actually made things were rarely documented in the way that the people who commissioned things were documented. But they existed. They were real people with real lives and real families, living in post-war Britain, sitting down to work on something that would outlast everything about their own lives by many decades. When they finished and handed the robe over and went home that day, the robe continued without them. The object survives the person. It carries the evidence of hands that shaped it long after those hands are gone. To understand what the robe meant to the people who saw it found in that wardrobe suite, you need to understand what the 1953 coronation meant, not as a historical event, not as a political moment, but as a lived human experience. And to understand that, you need to try to imagine what it was actually like to be in Britain in June of that year. The country was still recovering. That is the essential context. The Second World War had ended 8 years before, but 8 years, in the life of a nation that had been through what Britain had been through, is not a very long time. The rationing of food did not fully end until 1954, meaning that on the day of the coronation, the British people were still living with the day-to-day material restrictions of the war era. Bomb sites still marked the centers of major cities. Housing remained scarce. The economy was improving, but slowly, and the improvement was not evenly felt. Millions of people were still carrying the particular kind of exhaustion that accumulates when you have spent years existing under conditions of real stress and real scarcity, when the ordinary pleasures of ordinary life have been deferred for so long that you have almost forgotten what it felt like when they were available. Into this world, the coronation arrived like a door opening. Not a door that solved the problems or ended the difficulties, those would continue for years, but a door onto a different kind of feeling, a door onto the idea that the country was moving forward rather than simply enduring. The preparation for the ceremony had been underway for months, and for months the country had been half living in anticipation of it. The newspapers carried photographs of the abbey being prepared, of the regalia being polished, of the route being planned, of the young queen attending her rehearsals with the careful seriousness of someone who understood that what she was preparing for was not a performance but a commitment. The public, watching this unfold through the newspapers and the newsreels, felt something building that was difficult to name precisely. Not quite excitement, not quite ceremony, something more like readiness, a sense of gathering. Queen Elizabeth had acceded to the throne in February of 1952, at the age of 25, following the unexpected death of her father. She was young in a way that felt significant. Her youth was not a symbol of inexperience but of the future, of what came next, of the generation that would carry the country forward from the difficult years into whatever lay beyond them. The ceremony, delayed by more than a year to allow for the appropriate period of mourning and preparation, had by the time it arrived become something the country had been building toward for months. Most British households did not yet own a television set. People went to shops and knocked on neighbors' doors to ask if they could come and watch on a borrowed screen. 12 million people watched the coronation on television in Britain, the largest television audience the country had ever produced. Another 11 million listened on the radio. In cities and towns and villages across the country, streets were decorated with bunting, and street parties were organized, and children were given commemorative mugs and plates. Schools closed. Businesses paused. For a day, the country gathered around the same event and experienced it together in the way that shared national moments create a particular kind of memory, one that stays vivid for decades because so many people hold it simultaneously. At the center of all of it was a young woman in a coronation robe, kneeling, standing, receiving one element at a time, the formal and ancient symbols of a role that she had been called to without choosing it, and that she would carry for the rest of her life, without ever once, as far as anyone could tell from outside, seriously considering any other option. There is a moment in the coronation ceremony called the anointing, where the television cameras were switched off because the moment was considered too sacred for broadcast. In that private interval, the Archbishop of Canterbury anointed Queen Elizabeth with holy oil on her hands, her breast, and her head. Those present in the abbey described it as the most solemn few minutes of the entire ceremony, the moment at which the pageant became something deeper, something that had to do with a real human being making a real commitment in the presence of something larger than institutional tradition. When the cameras came back on, the transformation was complete. She was queen. In every sense the ceremony could make her so. She wore the coronation robe for the heart of that ceremony. It was placed on her shoulders by the Lord Great Chamberlain and fastened with its golden clasp, and it pulled behind her in an 18-foot train carried by 6 maids of honor. The photographs from those minutes show a woman whose posture is almost unnervingly still, the stillness not of someone who feels nothing, but of someone who is containing everything. She was not performing dignity, she was bearing it. After the coronation, the robe entered the royal collection, where it has been kept ever since. It was displayed during the Silver Jubilee in 1977, the Golden Jubilee in 2002, the Diamond Jubilee in 2012. Each time it appeared, the response from the public was the same, a kind of hushed recognition, the particular sensation of seeing something that existed only in photographs suddenly take on 3 dimensions and weight and presence. The robe had become part of the national memory in the way that very few objects manage. It carried 1953 inside it. It held the mourning, and it held the specific human being who had been at the center of that mourning. Not the queen, not the monarch, but the person. the 27-year-old woman who had kneeled on a cold stone floor in Westminster Abbey and accepted an entire life. There is a thing that happens when an object survives its moment. The moment, the specific, lived, unrepeatable occasion that gave the object its significance, passes and becomes history. But the object remains, physical and present, continuing to exist in ordinary time even as the moment it came from recedes. And because the object remains, the moment remains accessible, not fully recoverable, but near. Through the physical fact of the fabric, and the stitching, and the weight of it, you can feel the edge of the moment it came from. This is what museums understand about the objects in their care. This is why the encounter with the real thing is different from looking at a photograph of it. The object holds time in a way that a photograph does not. Queen Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96 years old. She had been queen for 70 years and 214 days, the longest reign in British history, and one of the longest of any monarchy in the world. She had been, by the time of her death, the only monarch most people alive had ever known. For the majority of the British public, she was not a historical figure who existed alongside other historical figures. She was a constant. She had always been there. And then, on a Thursday afternoon in September, she wasn't. The outpouring of public grief that followed her death was vast, and even for people who had expected it intellectually, surprising in its intensity. People queued for 14 and 16 hours to file past her coffin as she lay in state in Westminster Hall. The queue stretched for miles, at its longest, 4.5 miles through central London, and for 4 continuous days it moved without stopping. People arrived from other countries. People who had never met her and had no personal connection beyond the fact that she had been their queen, stood in that queue in the rain and the cold, and they knew, without needing to think about it, that they needed to be there. The flowers piled up in parks and outside palace gates until the smell of them was everywhere. A country that often struggles to express collective emotion expressed it, in those days, with a directness and an openness that surprised even those doing the expressing. The grief inside the palace was different in quality, though not in depth. Inside, the people who grieved were people who had known her, not known of her, known her. The staff who had worked alongside her for decades, who had seen her in the ordinary moments that public life never shows. The private secretaries, who had sat across a desk from her every day. The household aides who knew her preferences and her habits, and the particular dry wit that those who were close to her describe as one of the things they missed the most. These people did not grieve a symbol, they grieved a person, and the person they grieved was specific, made of particular habits and gestures and turns of phrase that no biography will ever fully capture. For Queen Consort Camilla, the loss was something that operated on several levels at once, and not all of them were simple to articulate. Camilla's history with Queen Elizabeth is one of the most complicated chapters in the story of the modern royal family. For many years, through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, Camilla occupied a position in the public mind that was almost exclusively defined by her connection to the breakdown of the marriage between Prince Charles and Princess Diana. The level of public animosity directed at her during this period was severe and sustained. She endured it, as far as anyone watching from the outside could tell, with a quietness that many people misread as indifference, and that those who knew her understood to be something else entirely. It was endurance. It was patience. It was the decision, made and remade every day, to simply continue being who she was without fighting the narrative that had been constructed around her. There is a version of her story that is easy to tell. The story of a woman who was associated with a painful and public marital breakdown, who spent years as the object of public disapproval, and who eventually found, through time and the visible reality of her relationship with Charles and with the royal family, a measure of public acceptance. That version is true, as far as it goes, but there is another version that is less often told, about what that long period of difficulty actually meant from the inside, about what it cost to maintain composure and dignity under conditions that would test most people to their limits. about what kind of person you become, or reveal yourself to be, when that kind of pressure is sustained over many years? The answer, in Camilla's case, seems to be this: someone who is patient, who is discreet, who does not perform her feelings for external audiences, and who understands that the way through difficult circumstances is not to fight them, but to simply continue being yourself. This quality, the quality of persisting without fighting, of continuing without demanding acknowledgement for the continuing, is one that is rarely celebrated because it is rarely visible. It does not produce moments. It does not generate narrative. It simply accumulates, slowly and invisibly, into something that eventually becomes undeniable. A track record of having been, year after year, exactly who you said you were. Camilla's track record, accumulated over the years, when nobody was particularly disposed to give her credit for it, was eventually legible to the people whose legibility mattered most. Queen Elizabeth was one of those people, and her judgment, once formed, was not lightly revised. This is not a flashy quality. It does not make for compelling drama, but it is, in the long run, one of the most effective ways there is of living a life. Queen Elizabeth recognized this. The late Queen had an extraordinary ability to hold two things at once: her personal feelings about a situation and her understanding of what was best for the institution she had devoted her life to. She was not someone who made things easy or simple when they were not easy or simple. But she was also deeply practical, and she understood people with the accuracy of someone who has spent 70 years watching how they actually behave, rather than how they are expected to behave. Over the years, Queen Elizabeth and Camilla had built something that could only be described as a genuine understanding. Not a performance of warmth for public consumption, but an actual human connection developed quietly over time, in private, in the same way most genuine relationships are actually built. There were small gestures, private moments, a kind word at the right time, a shared sense of humor about the particular absurdity of the life they both inhabited. By the final years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, those who worked closely with both women described the warmth between them as real and hard-won, which made it more valuable, not less. So when Queen Elizabeth died, Camilla lost more than a mother-in-law, more than a monarch. She lost someone who had, after a great deal of difficulty and time, come to genuinely accept her, someone who had made room for her in a way that carried specific weight, precisely because the room-making had not come automatically. And that kind of loss, the loss of someone whose acceptance meant something earned and real, sits differently than other kinds. It was in this state of grief that Camilla made a request, not through the institutional channels that govern access to the royal collection. A personal request, made quietly, through someone who understood what she was asking and why. The Coronation Robe was transferred from its archival storage at Windsor Castle to Camilla's private wardrobe suite at Buckingham Palace, where it remained, sealed in its casing, for several months. She did not ask to wear it. This matters and should be stated plainly, because it is easy to misread the gesture if you don't understand what she was actually asking for. The robe belonged to the royal collection, not to her, and Camilla has always understood with precision where the lines are and why they matter. She was not asking for something that wasn't hers. She was asking for something simpler than that, and in some ways harder to explain. She wanted it near her. 1. Grief does strange things to the geography of a life. It changes what matters and what doesn't. It relocates your attention from the future to the past and back again without warning. It makes certain objects unbearably significant and renders others, which seemed important before, almost invisible. Most people who have lost someone they loved will understand, without needing it explained, the particular pull of objects that carry the presence of the person who is gone. We keep the cardigan that belonged to a grandmother long after it has stopped smelling like her, because putting it in a charity bag would feel like a small act of erasure, and we are not ready for that. We keep a father's old watch in a drawer, even though we never wind it and would never wear it, because it was his, and because its presence in the drawer is a form of his continued presence in the house. We keep letters and notebooks and in certain cases very ordinary objects, a coffee mug, a pair of reading glasses, a pen that ran out of ink years ago, that carried no particular significance in the person's life, but carry enormous significance now because they were simply, physically, there. They were touched, they were used, they were near. For Camilla, the coronation robe was the most significant object she could think of, not because it had been a personal possession of Queen Elizabeth's in the ordinary sense. It wasn't. It was an institutional item held by the royal collection, but because of what it showed, because of the moment it was connected to, because when you stand in front of that robe, or even know that it is in the same room as you, what you are near is Queen Elizabeth at the very beginning, a young woman at the moment she said yes to a lifetime of something extraordinary. And all the years that followed, all the decades and all the accumulated weight of everything she carried through them, are contained in the moment that robe represents, the way a river is already entirely present in its source. If you had known that woman across years, if you had had the complicated and hard-won experience of being genuinely accepted by her, of earning something from her that she did not give easily, and that meant more because it had not been given automatically. If you had sat with her in rooms that cameras never entered and understood her in the specific, irreplaceable way that you understand people you actually know, rather than people you have only heard about, then that robe was the most complete portrait of her that existed anywhere in the world. It held her at her beginning. It held what she had been before all of it, and it held the commitment that made all of it possible. People inside the palace household who knew about the request understood it immediately. Not one of them questioned it. Several of them, it is said, felt something catch in their own chests when they heard about it, because grief has a way of making itself legible even when it is not spoken aloud. You see someone doing something that does not quite make rational sense on the surface, and you understand it completely underneath, and that understanding is itself a kind of comfort. It is a recognition that passes between people without needing words. On certain evenings, not every evening, not according to any schedule, but on the evenings when the weight of everything was particularly present, when the constant forward motion of the new reign and the demands of a new role pressed most heavily, Camilla would go to that room. She would sit near the casing. Sometimes she would open the ivory cloth just enough to see the crimson velvet. She did not disturb the preservation. She did not handle what she had no right to handle. She simply sat with it, the way you sit with something that connects you to someone you have lost. There is a particular quality of silence in a room where someone is sitting with grief. It is different from ordinary silence the way grief is different from ordinary sadness, heavier, more specific, more aware of itself. It occupies the room differently. It makes the furniture more present somehow, more solid, as if the physical objects in the room are doing the work of being real, that the person inside it temporarily cannot do alone. Most people who have sat in a room in that particular kind of silence know exactly what this means, even if they have never described it in these terms. It is the silence of the hour after the guests leave, and the house is suddenly loud with the absence of the person who should be coming home to it. It is the silence of the long evenings in the weeks after a funeral, when the noise and the company of the ceremony have ended, and what is left is the daily reality of the empty chair and the unwatched television. Grief, in those silences, is not abstract. It is specific and present and physical in a way that is almost like a second person in the room. People who have experienced this kind of room know what it feels like. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is a full silence, almost pressurized, the kind that holds rather than empties, the kind that forms around grief when grief has nowhere else to go and simply stays, taking up the space it needs. Throughout this period, Camilla's public life continued in its full and demanding form. The state funeral required weeks of preparation and coordination, the obligations of transition, the adjustment of titles, addresses, official stationery, the hundreds of practical and symbolic details that shift when a reign changes hands, were relentless. Engagements had to be attended, visits made. The photographs were still taken, the speeches still delivered, the dignified public face that the role demands was maintained with the thoroughness the role required. This is the defining characteristic of life inside a public institution. It does not pause for private grief, no matter how large the grief. You hold both things at once. You learn to. The wardrobe suite, on those evenings, was the place where Camilla did not have to hold both things at once, where she did not have to perform anything or maintain anything, where she could simply be a person sitting near something that connected her to someone she missed, for as long as she needed to be exactly that, nothing more, nothing less. None of this was a secret within the palace. The household staff were aware. The senior aides who managed the logistics of her private quarters knew, but it was not something discussed beyond the people who needed to know. It was a private matter, treated with the discretion that private matters inside a royal household receive when they are understood to be genuine and harmless and deeply human. The coronation of King Charles III took place on the 6th of May 2023. Camilla stood beside her husband in Westminster Abbey, the same building where, 70 years earlier, a young queen had been crowned in a ceremony watched by 12 million people on television. Now it was Camilla herself who was crowned queen alongside Charles, wearing her own robe of state, carrying forward a tradition that stretched back through centuries. It was a moment of extraordinary personal significance, arriving at the end of a journey that nobody, including Camilla, would have predicted decades earlier. In the weeks that followed, as the new reign settled into its rhythm, and the long, difficult period of transition finally resolved into the more ordinary demands of simply doing the job, the question of the coronation robe of Queen Elizabeth II came back to the surface. The Royal Collection Trust had always known it would need to be returned. Now the time had come, and it was in this context that the routine security sweep was scheduled, not as a response to any suspicion, just the regular timetable, and 4 experienced guards began their unremarkable morning. The guards had not known the robe was there. When they found it, their instinct was correct. Stop, call someone, do not handle it. They followed their training, and their professionalism is part of what made what came next go as smoothly as it did. After the archivist identified the robe, a senior member of the royal household was notified. From there, the information reached Camilla within a short time. The senior official who carried the news did not approach the situation as a confrontation. He was experienced enough to understand what he was actually dealing with. Not a security breach, not an act of bad faith, but something more human and more complex than either of those things. What the moment called for was not institutional rigidity. It was discretion and care, and the particular combination of formal responsibility and genuine understanding that distinguishes people who are genuinely good at working inside sensitive institutions. Camilla met the news calmly. She had always known the robe would need to be returned. She had never intended to keep it indefinitely. When she had made the request for it to be brought to her quarters, she had been in the raw early weeks of grief, and the robe had done what she had needed it to do. It had given her something to be near, during a period when nearness to anything connected to the person she had lost was what the grief required. That period had passed. The grief had not disappeared, because grief does not disappear, but it had shifted into a different shape, something she could carry differently, something that had found its place alongside everything else she carried every day. She explained this to the official simply and without embellishment, the way people speak when they are not trying to convince anyone of anything, only telling the truth. The robe had been brought to her because she had needed it near her during a difficult time. She had kept it in its casing, treated it with care, not worn it or damaged it in any way. She had always known it would go back, and she was ready for it to go back now. The official listened without interruption. When she finished, there was a moment of quiet. Then he said he understood and thanked her for explaining. That was more or less the end of the conversation. No formal inquiry was opened. No disciplinary process was initiated. The matter was reviewed at the appropriate level, and the conclusion was the same one that most reasonable people, given the full picture, would reach themselves. A grieving woman had asked for something that brought her comfort. She had handled it with care. She had caused no harm to anyone or anything. The robe was undamaged. Its preservation integrity was intact. The only thing that had changed was its location, and that was now being corrected. The review that followed the discovery says something worth noting about the royal household's capacity to hold institutional responsibility and human understanding at the same time. There are institutions that would have treated this as a procedural breach first and a human situation second, or not at all. That would have opened a formal inquiry and followed the formal process to its formal conclusion, generating documentation and consequences regardless of the actual substance of what had happened. That is not what occurred here. What occurred reflects a more accurate understanding of what institutions are actually for. Institutions are made of people. They exist to serve purposes that are, at their foundation, human. When the formal rules would produce outcomes disproportionate to the actual reality of a situation, the institution that handles things well is the one that recognizes the gap and makes a judgment. The judgment made in this case was straightforward. Return the robe to its proper storage and note the incident at the appropriate level. Nothing more was required. Nothing more was done. The logistics of the return were handled with the quiet efficiency that the Royal Collection Trust brings to everything it does. A textile conservator examined the robe in detail and found everything as it should be: the velvet undamaged, the ermine intact, the gold lace holding. Fresh archival materials were prepared. Within 48 hours of its discovery, the coronation robe of Queen Elizabeth II had been returned to Windsor Castle, logged back into the catalogue, and placed once more in the climate-controlled environment designed to keep it intact for the next century. She asked to spend a few minutes alone with it. Not long, just a few minutes. The archivist withdrew from the room. The senior official withdrew. The guards stepped back from the corridor. They did this without being asked more than once, and in some cases, without being asked at all. They understood what the request was and what it was for. They gave it the space it needed. The door to the wardrobe suite closed. For a few minutes, no one knows exactly how many, and it does not particularly matter, Camilla was alone in that room with the robe. In a room full of preserved gowns and polished wood and the faint smell of cedar that old wardrobes always carry. Nobody was there to observe or record or report on what happened in those minutes. Nobody was supposed to be. What happened belongs to the person who was in it, and after that to no one at all, which is perhaps how it should be. When the door opened again, Camilla walked out composed and quiet. She thanked the archivist. She thanked the official. She did not speak at length about anything. There was somewhere else to be. There was always somewhere else to be. And she went. The guards who had been present in and around that wardrobe suite that morning have described the experience, at some distance of time and in various private conversations, in terms that are remarkably consistent. One of them said it was the most human thing he had witnessed in many years inside the palace. Another said that standing outside that closed door, he felt clearly that he was in the presence of something private and real, something that the ordinary vocabulary of duty and protocol and institutional responsibility was not quite adequate to describe. He said it felt like a real goodbye. He said that in the fullest and simplest possible sense of the phrase. A person saying goodbye to someone they had lost, through the object that carried that person's most important morning. Those 4 guards went home at the end of their shift, carrying something they had not expected to carry. Not the information. They would not speak about the information beyond what was appropriate, but the feeling of the thing, the weight of having been present at something that was real, in the way that very few things inside a formal institution ever get to be real. There is something about this story that keeps pulling people back to it when they hear it, and it is not the intrigue of an unexpected discovery or the particular drama of a famous robe found in an unlikely location. Those elements give the story its shape, but the shape is not the thing. The thing is what is inside the shape. What is inside is something much more ordinary and much more difficult: grief, and what people do with it when no one is watching. The specific details of this story, the palace, the robe, the royal family, the weight of the coronation, and everything it represented, give it its particular texture. But underneath the details is something that belongs to everyone who has ever lost someone and had to keep going anyway. The impulse to hold on to an object because you cannot hold on to the person. The need to find a quiet space inside a life that doesn't offer many quiet spaces, where you can simply be with what you are actually carrying. The moment of saying goodbye in private, after the public goodbyes are long over, because the private goodbye is the one that actually counts. Most of us will never experience loss inside a palace. Most of us will never have a coronation robe to sit near. but almost all of us will recognize the shape of what Camilla did. The watch in the drawer, the cardigan still in the wardrobe, the quiet 10 minutes in a room that no one else knew to look for. Queen Elizabeth II was, by any honest measure, one of the most remarkable public figures of the 20th century. She became queen at 25 without choosing to, and remained queen until she died at 96 without once, as far as anyone could tell, seriously considering any other option. She navigated personal tragedies and institutional crises and the enormous shifts in British culture and society that made the country at the end of her reign almost unrecognizable from the country it had been when she began. She did all of this with a consistency and a sense of purpose that most people never quite managed to sustain across a whole lifetime. And she wore the coronation robe exactly once. That is the thing about ceremonial objects. They are used in a single moment, and then preserved, and from that point on, they carry the full weight of that moment inside them. The robe does not know it was worn for a coronation. It has no awareness of its own significance. But we bring significance to it because we need somewhere to put the feelings that the moment generated, and objects are good at holding feelings. They are patient, they do not change, they stay exactly as they were. The world has a tendency to mythologize people who live inside royal palaces, to smooth away the human edges and make them into figures rather than people, symbols rather than human beings. This tendency is understandable. The institution invites it, and there is something in most of us that wants the people at the center of great public moments to be larger than ordinary. We want them to be equal to the weight of what they carry, but the weight of what they carry is, in the end, also very ordinary. The same weight everyone carries, the weight of loving people and losing them, the weight of time passing and things changing, the weight of carrying on in the face of what cannot be changed. The only difference for people in Camilla's position is that they carry this weight in public, inside a set of ceremonies and expectations that leave almost no room for the private version of any human experience, which is why the private moments matter so much when they surface. Which is why this story matters, not because it is dramatic or scandalous or surprising, but because it is real, because it tells you something true about what it costs to live a life shaped by public expectation, and about the small private spaces that people find inside that life when they need them. Minga. There is something specific that happens to a person who spends years carrying something heavy in public, in the full view of everyone, and then finds a private place to set it down for a moment. It is not relief exactly. The weight does not go away, because the weight never fully goes away. But there is a quality of honesty to it that is different from anything you get in the public sphere. In private, you do not have to hold the weight the way you have learned to hold it in front of other people. You do not have to calibrate how much of it is showing, or maintain the particular posture that says to the room, "I am managing this." You can simply carry it the way it actually feels, which is heavier and more awkward and more human than any public version of the carrying could ever be. This is what Camilla had in those evenings in the wardrobe suite. Not a solution, not a cure, not even rest, exactly. Grief does not allow for the kind of rest that leaves you feeling restored when you wake. But honesty, the honest experience of being someone who has lost someone, alone with the thing that connected her to the person she had lost, without any requirement to manage how that looked or how much of it was appropriate to show. People who work in households like Buckingham Palace develop over years a particular kind of attentiveness to the private lives of the people they serve. Not the prurient attentiveness of someone looking for information, but the functional attentiveness of someone who needs to anticipate what is required and provide it without being asked. The best household staff are almost invisible in their presence, present enough to be useful, unobtrusive enough that the people they serve can live their private lives without feeling observed. And part of what this skill requires is the ability to recognize, without being told, when something private is happening that should be given space rather than assistance. This was one of those times. The household staff who were aware of what Camilla was doing in the wardrobe suite on those evenings treated it with the same discretion they brought to every other aspect of her private life. They did not discuss it among themselves beyond what was necessary. They did not ask questions. They made sure the room was accessible when she needed it to be, and they ensured that the casing was treated with the care it deserved in the ordinary course of the suite's management. That was all that was asked of them, and that was all that they did. The coronation, when it came in May of 2023, was a moment that connected directly to everything this story is about, in ways that Camilla herself would have felt, even if she never said so explicitly. She stood in Westminster Abbey, in the same building where the robe had been worn 70 years before, and she received her own crown and her own robe of state. She became, formally, what she had for years been in the making of becoming, and in the moment of her own crowning, she was in some sense also a witness to the completion of a long arc that had begun in 1953 with a young woman in a crimson velvet robe, and that had passed through all the complicated years of the intervening decades, and that had arrived here, in this moment, with all of that history folded inside it. There are no photographs of what Camilla looked like in the moments before the ceremony began, in the private minutes before everything became official and public and formally recorded. The photographs show what was shown: the ceremony, the crowning, the public moment made permanent in the way that public moments are made permanent. But before all of that, in the antechambers and the quiet preparatory spaces that the cameras did not enter, she was simply a person about to do something significant, carrying with her the weight of everything that had led to it, the weight of years, the weight of what had been hard, the weight of what had been lost, and the weight of what, against everything that might once have been predicted, had been found. It would be an overstatement to say that sitting near the coronation robe of Queen Elizabeth II in a private wardrobe suite on quiet autumn evenings had prepared her for this moment. Grief does not prepare you for things. It does not translate neatly into readiness or strength or the particular composure that the photographs would later show. But it is true that having had a space in which to be genuinely with the grief, having had those evenings of honest private sadness, those minutes of sitting near something that connected her to the person she was missing, meant that the grief had somewhere to live. It was not simply stuffed under the surface of the public performance, waiting to leak out at a moment when that would have been impossible to manage. It had been given its space, it had been acknowledged, it had been sat with. And so when the moment of the ceremony came, the carrying was a little different than it would have been otherwise. This is the most human thing about the story, when you think about it all the way through. Not the robe itself, though the robe is extraordinary. Not the discovery, though the discovery is strange and specific and memorable. The most human thing is the simple fact that grief, even inside a life as extraordinary as the one Camilla was living, still needed the things that grief always needs. The quiet room, the object that held a presence, the evenings of honest private feeling, given space to be exactly what they were, without audience and without management, and without the expectation of any particular outcome, just the grief and the object and the silence, doing the slow and necessary work of grief. The coronation robe of Queen Elizabeth II is in Windsor Castle now, in proper archival storage, properly cared for, properly catalogued, preserved with the meticulous attention that the Royal Collection Trust brings to the most significant objects in its holding. Its crimson velvet is in good condition, its ermine trim is intact, its gold lace is as it was when it was made, each stitch holding, the whole piece continuing forward in time, just as it was designed to do. It will be brought out on significant occasions, as it has been before. People will stand in front of it and feel the particular thing that you feel when you are near an object that carries a famous moment inside it, the pull of a morning that was enormous and is now past, made briefly present again through the physical fact of the thing that was there. What they may not know, unless they have heard this story, is that the robe carries something else now. The Royal Collection Trust catalogues the physical condition of every object in its care, the state of the fibers, the integrity of the seams, the condition of the dyes and the finishings. What it cannot catalog, and what no archive can hold, is the accumulated meaning that objects acquire as they move through time and through the lives of people who need them. That accumulated meaning is real. It is not mystical and it is not fanciful. It is simply the honest record of what objects are asked to carry, what they are put near, what they are reached for, what they are held in the presence of. The robe was made to carry the 1953 coronation, and it has carried it faithfully for more than 70 years. And now it carries something else as well, something smaller and more private, something that happened in a room that most people will never see, on evenings that went entirely unrecorded. It carries the autumn and winter of 2022. It carries the knowledge that it was not alone during the long, difficult, quiet months that followed the end of the longest reign in British history. That it was taken out of its climate-controlled storage and placed in a private room in a palace, and that someone sat near it on evenings when that was what was needed. And that before it was taken back, a door was closed and a few minutes passed in private, and a goodbye was said that nobody recorded, because it was said to and for the person it was intended for, and that was enough. Objects carry things. Everyone who has ever kept something that belonged to someone they lost already knows this. The watch in the drawer, the cardigan on the shelf, the handwriting on a piece of paper you cannot bring yourself to throw away. Objects are patient. They do not forget. They hold the weight of moments that the people who experience those moments cannot always carry alone. The Coronation Robe holds 1953 inside it. It holds Westminster Abbey on a June morning, the particular silence of 2,000 people gathered around a single solemn act. The image of a young woman kneeling on cold stone and accepting, one element at a time, the entire weight of a life she had been called to. It holds all of that in its fibers, the way old things hold the energy of the moments they have been part of. And now it holds an autumn evening in a private room in Buckingham Palace, a closed door, a few minutes of silence that belong to one person and to no one else. The robe holds that too, in the same patient way it holds everything else, quietly, completely, without drama. What the discovery of the robe in the wardrobe suite actually did, when the story began to find its way outward from the palace, carefully, quietly, in the way that palace stories always travel, through the careful mouths of people who knew how much to say and when, was give people something they had not quite had before. A specific, human image of what it looks like to grieve someone like Queen Elizabeth from the inside, not from the outside, which was everywhere in the days and weeks after her death, in the flowers and the cues and the newspaper front pages and the television coverage, from the inside, from the private side, from the side that belongs not to history or to the nation, but to the individual people who actually knew her. The public grief for Queen Elizabeth was extraordinary and genuine, and it mattered, but it was also, inevitably, grief for a symbol as much as for a person. People mourned what she represented: stability, continuity, the sense of an unbroken thread running through the decades of a changing country. They mourned the longest reign, the constant presence, the particular kind of reassurance that comes from knowing that the same person has been there, doing the same job, for longer than most people alive can remember. This grief was real, but it was not the grief of someone who had sat across a desk from her every day for 20 years, or who had learned to read the particular quality of her silence, or who had made her laugh in a specific and unrepeatable way on an ordinary afternoon. The grief of the people who actually knew Queen Elizabeth was different in kind, smaller in some ways. Not a national event, not something that hundreds of thousands of strangers would queue to be part of, but more specific, more individual, made of the particular details that belong to a real relationship rather than to a symbolic one. And those details, in grief, are the ones that hurt the most. Not the grand public figure, whom you can still see in the photographs and the newsreels, but the specific way she said something, the specific look she gave when she found something unexpectedly funny, the specific weight of an afternoon spent in her company, which you will not have again. The coronation robe carried all of that, not because it was connected to those private moments. It wasn't. It was connected to the grandest and most public moment of all, but because in holding the public moment so completely, it held the woman who had lived through everything that came after it. It held the thread that ran from 1953 to 2022 and connected the young queen kneeling in the abbey to the woman who died at 96 at Balmoral. The whole 70 years of it was somehow present in the object, the way a person's whole life can be somehow present in their face near the end, not literally, not magically, but in some way that is real and recognizable to the people who look closely enough. History lives in many places. in books and monuments and great public occasions designed specifically to be remembered. But it also lives in the quiet things, in the private gestures and the closed doors, and the goodbyes that happen after the public ceremonies are over, when it is just a person and the weight of what they have lived through and whatever they have found, in whatever form it takes, to help them carry it a little further. The people who were part of this story, the guards who found the robe, the archivist who identified it, the senior official who carried the news, the household staff who had quietly known about the evenings in the wardrobe suite, went on with their lives in the ordinary way. Most of them will never speak publicly about what they experienced. That is the nature of working inside an institution that operates on discretion as a foundational principle. The things you see and hear in the private rooms of palaces are not yours to share, and the people who understand this and honor it are the ones who are trusted with access to those rooms in the first place. But the things they carry, privately, are real. The guard who said it felt like a real goodbye was not being sentimental or overstating what he witnessed. He was naming something accurately. And the accuracy of his naming, the fact that 4 working men doing a security sweep on an ordinary morning came away from it carrying the particular weight of having been in the presence of genuine human grief, honestly expressed, in a private room, is itself part of the story. It is the part that reminds you that the human moments don't only belong to the people at the center of them. They ripple outward. They touch the people who happen to be present, unexpectedly, when something real occurs. Grief is like this. It does not stay neatly inside the person experiencing it. It radiates. It makes itself felt by people who have no particular claim on it. A stranger weeping on a train, the particular silence that falls over a room when someone who was there is suddenly not, the quality of an afternoon that has changed without the shape of it changing at all. Grief is one of the most contagious of human states, not because it transfers its specific content from one person to another, but because it activates in the people who encounter it a recognition of their own capacity for the same thing. You see someone else's grief, and you feel your own, the ones you have already felt, and the ones you know are still coming. That is what happened to the men who stood outside a closed door in a royal wardrobe suite on a quiet morning in the latter part of the reign's transition. They encountered grief, specific, private, honest, contained within a few minutes of solitude behind a door they had respectfully closed, and it activated in them a recognition of something they knew. Not the particular grief, not the specific relationship, or the specific loss, or the specific robe that had brought it all to a head in that specific room, but the shape of the thing, the weight of it, the particular quality of silence that belongs to it. They carried that home, and in a small and unannounced way, they were richer for it, not in spite of the grief they had encountered, but because of it. Because grief, when it is honest and when it is witnessed with care, does something to the people who are near it. It deepens them. It reminds them of what matters. It connects them, briefly and genuinely, to the most important things, the people they love, the losses they have survived, the weight they carry themselves, and the quiet ways they have found to carry it. Some stories earn their place in the telling because they are dramatic, or because they are scandalous, or because they reveal something that was being hidden. This story earns its place in a quieter way. It reveals something that was not exactly hidden. Grief is not hidden, it is simply private, but that was not visible in the way that public events are visible. It pulls back the curtain not on a secret, but on a private truth. And the private truth it reveals is one that most people will recognize from their own lives, even if the circumstances of their recognition are nothing like the circumstances of the story itself. That is what makes it worth knowing. Not the palace, not the robe, not the famous name or the famous moment. The recognizability, the way it holds, inside all of its extraordinary specificity, something completely ordinary, something that belongs to all of us, because grief belongs to all of us, and the ways people find to live inside it belong to all of us, and the small, quiet acts of continuing, of sitting near what connects us to what we have lost, of allowing ourselves to be honest about what we are carrying, of closing a door and saying goodbye before we go back out into the world, belong to all of us. That is what this story is, and that is why it stays with you.